Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, first reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, visit jnf.org. All right, as for this episode, this is my first recording since returning from a 3-week trip to Israel. I was there from the 1st to the 24th of January, 2024, and we're recording this episode on Thursday, the 1st of February. And I can't think of a better guest to join me after my return than Ambassador Ido Aharoni. No stranger to JNF USA and IsraelCast, Ido is a 25-year veteran of Israel's Foreign Service and was Israel's longest-serving Consul-General in New York in the tri-state area, overseeing the operations of Israel's largest diplomatic mission from 2010 to 2016. He's a public diplomacy specialist, founder of the Brand Israel program, and a well-known nation branding practitioner. Ido served as Global Distinguished Professor for International Relations at New York University's Graduate School of Arts and Science. Today, he's a senior faculty member of the Koller School of Management at Tel Aviv University. He's active in numerous international bodies, including serving as chairman of the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy. And with that, it's an absolute joy and pleasure to welcome Ambassador Ido Aharoni to IsraelCast once again, who joins us now on the line via Zoom from his home in Israel. Ido, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Well, listen, I really want to hopscotch through a number of topics with you in our conversation, the time that we have today, Ido. And, you know, one of the many observations I had during my trip to Israel, certainly, is just the depth to which everybody and really every facet of life has been impacted by October 7th and continues to be. Certainly, your son is in reservist right now, and I'm just wondering if you can just weigh in on that, how really this has truly, truly impacted every single Israeli.
Absolutely. You know, at the end of the day, the community here is small. You know, it's 10 million people. But when you consider you know, that about 500,000 people are serving in the army in one capacity or another in the security apparatus, then 500,000, you know, they have family, extended family, so they have friends. So there's not one person that I know, including many Arab Israelis, that was not touched by it, meaning that does not know someone who was affected, a victim, someone who was injured, someone who was abducted. In my case, I know all three categories, several people. And so obviously it changes the mood of the nation. And that's what you're seeing now. You're seeing a collective, again, including Arab Israelis, and we can address that, why it's happening, a collective that is really united in focusing on the task at hand, which is to make sure that we can resume life. Because if there's one thing that we can take away from October 7th is that we cannot live like that. And no society should live like that, including our enemies. They shouldn't live like that, with the constant threat of an unpredictable, genocidal death cult like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis in Yemen. And so this has to be addressed. This has to be handled. And I think that the entire Israeli society, left and right, they're united in that quest.
And when we talk about being united, you just invoke the Arab community within Israel. And for the most part, when we've seen statistics, they also are very much on board with Israel's efforts.
Yes, and also the rest of the Arab world, which makes the support that Hamas is getting in the United States all the more bizarre. But we will talk about that too. But the main reason why the Arab Israelis are not on board, and it was part of the Iranian plan to inflame a multi-front struggle for Israel. Hamas from the south, simultaneously with Hezbollah from the north, pro-Iranian militias from the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, pro-Hamas groups from the West Bank, right here, next to where I live, and then Arab Israelis. So they had 5 components of in their multi-front fantasy, and the Arab Israelis are not on board because of a very simple reason. Hamas massacred tens of Muslims. They published their videos. They mutilated their bodies. They humiliated them. And they did all of that only because of something that I heard from you many times, guilt by association. Meaning the fact that they worked in the music festival because it was on Saturday. Arab Israelis worked in the music festival. Arab Israelis worked in the kibbutzim. Thai citizens also worked as farmers in those communities. They were all killed. Their bodies were tortured, mutilated, only because they associated with Jews. And the same way we were exposed to all those videos through our WhatsApp groups, Arab Israelis were exposed to those videos. And in particular, there was one video in which Hamas captured an Arab Israeli. They interrogate him about his knowledge of Quran to make sure that he's a Muslim, because he says, I'm a Muslim. And just to remind our listeners and our viewers that according to Islam, you don't kill Muslims, right? And he performed sufficiently. He answered all their questions correctly about the Quran. And yet, they tied him to a pole in one of the intersections in the south, outside of one of the communities, and then they shot him in the belly. And this whole thing took about 45 minutes of torture, humiliation, and then they left him there, convinced that he's dead, but he didn't. He survived. Now that video circulated in the Arab society and had a tremendous impact because it showed Israel's Arab citizens that Hamas brutality, cruelty, and inhumanity is not exclusive to Jews. It's also for people who associate with Jews, like those Arab workers and the Thai workers.
Ido, I want to pick up on something that I believe you said, and that's that Muslim nations are also supporting Israel in its effort against Hamas. Can you elaborate on that? Because certainly the leadership may be, but it seems to me that the folk on the street are not, and certainly the media are not in support of what Israel's doing.
Correct. So the public sentiment is certainly not on our side, never been on our side, even with a country like Egypt, where we've had decades of peace. And strangely enough, I think it's something that we touched upon in one of our conversations. In the Middle East, when you say peace, it's usually not the kind of relations that, let's say, United States has with Canada. It's more like what the United States used to have with Cuba, meaning peace is largely non-belligerency. That's what it means. No war means peace. That's why we call our agreements normalization agreements, because it's not just non-belligerency is not enough. You have to have normal ties put in place, cultivated and nurtured. This is not what we have with Egypt. This is not what we have with Jordan. It's more like it with the UAE. So there are several. So absolutely correct. The public sentiment never been on our side. Certainly the media, to the extent the media reflects any real discussion in the Arab world. But certainly the governments, the regimes, They understand that Hamas, which stems from the Muslim Brothers of Egypt, an organization that was founded about 100 years ago in Egypt, that is a manifestation of their ideology that threatens the stability of every regime, every government in the Arab world. That's why, for example, you hear from the Saudis that the deal of normalization with Israel is not off the table at all. They're still talking about it, and many observers, including some senior American officials, say it will happen. It's only a question of time. You don't see the Arab world galvanized around the plight of Hamas or the Palestinians in general. And again, the reason is because Hamas did something that ISIS did. Hamas did something that Al Qaeda did, and basically violated the basic tenets of Islam. And it's very difficult for leaders, either secular or religious, to support such an organization. And again, I say, and this puts the support for Hamas on US colleges in a more bizarre light.
And we're going to talk about what's happening on college campuses in just a second. Just going back to the notion of word on the Arab street, if you will, on a very personal level. I was in Iraq over a year ago at the end of 2022. And one of my Iraqi friends, someone that I befriended there, after October 7th, sent me a message saying, I can't take it anymore. I'm tired of all of this fundamentalism. I want to leave here. I want to move to Europe. Then I had somebody else who was posting a lot of misinformation, shall we say, the typical things that you see, the typical misinformation. And to his credit, I did have a conversation with him. We FaceTimed, and I sort of debunked each one of his points. And I asked him, where did you learn all of this? Where did you get all of this? He said, well, I learned about it in school. Everybody knows about it. So I'm just wondering, how do you begin, and can you even begin to affect change in the Arab world, on the Arab street?
Very difficult. I think the Americans tried to do it after 9/11 and failed. In some places, the tribal nature of society is a big impediment to achieve any kind of collective, collective foundation of knowledge. And the Americans, perhaps the last big foreign policy success the United States had was, of course, the introduction of the Marshall Plan after World War II, with the recovery and the rebuilding of Germany and the rebuilding of Japan. Here you have two countries, two nations that went from being extremely militant, one of them responsible for two world wars during the 20th century, Germany, the other that displayed an unbelievable level of cruelty and brutality, Japan. And how do you turn them into two democratic society, open society, pluralistic societies, and societies that shy away from militarism? I would say almost pacifistic. How do you do that? And of course, the answer is you invest heavily in educational infrastructure, in soft power, and of course, in the economy. And the American investment in all those three things paid off in a very big way. Fast forward, the reaction to 9/11. Sadly, the Americans made a decision not to attack Iran, which was and still is the inspirational source of every Muslim terrorist group in the world. And they decided to attack Iraq and Afghanistan, and again, introduced the notion of democracy and pluralism and freedom. Of course, it didn't work. And again, it didn't work because in the case of Iraq, because Iraq was never a cohesive political unit. You had the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds in the north. It was always fragmented. In many ways, Iraq was an artificial creation of the powers at the time, France and Great Britain. And Afghanistan, of course, is a ultra tribal society, and very difficult to do that when you have tribal considerations that come first. It's very, very difficult to introduce pluralism and democracy to traditional tribal societies. And I know that some people may accuse me of being not politically correct, but empirically, that's what you're seeing. Same thing is happening in Africa. Same thing is happening in Africa. Tribalism stands in the way, and you can understand why, because democracy is based on ideas that negate the very DNA of protecting my tribe.
It's about destroying an ideology. And, I have to say, I consider myself a rather optimistic person, but I'm rather pessimistic when it comes to how and when we can destroy this cult of death, this ideology that is Hamas. Because, I mean, I think it's very different to Nazism and how that was destroyed, and also this sort of cult of the emperor in Japan. This is just 12,000 levels deeper and so entrenched. And then you have also the land issue. So I have no idea how people are going to even begin to address that moving forward. And like I say, I just personally, I'm pessimistic.
Well, the main concern is that the West lost its desire to fix the world. If the West had lost that desire back in the 1940s, we wouldn't be sitting here. And so that's my main concern.
Yeah.
My main concern is that countries like the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, Germany lost the desire to be vigilant, to understand that this is not about Israel. This is not about the Palestinians. This is not about Gaza. There's a much bigger play here. This is an effort led by Russia, to a certain degree by China, with active participation of Iran and its proxies, and to a certain degree, active participation of Turkey. Now we know that South Africa is joining the club. And the purpose of this axis, and by the way, and I do hope that South Africa will pay a very heavy price for their mistake, to side with Russia and to go against the United States. That's what they did in The Hague. That's exactly what they did in The Hague.
Yeah.
This was not about justice. It had nothing to do. This was pure revenge for the support the people that founded apartheid South Africa had given the Zionist movement in its early days, even before apartheid. Same people like Jan Smuts and others supported Zionism, just like Winston Churchill at the time. And that axis wants to undermine the dominance of the United States. That axis wants to undermine the dominance of Western mindset. And it's happening in several locations simultaneously, in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the Red Sea with the Houthis, and probably in other places as well, if we will not handle it. Now, when I say that the West lost its desire to fight for what is right, then I mean that they're leaving the people here in the region, not just Israel, Saudi Arabia, other actors, totally exposed to the toxicity and the danger of the Russian-led axis. And this could have dire implications. And when people talk about the possibility of a global confrontation that will erupt, this is real. This is not just a theoretical option. It is a scenario that if the United States will not understand that we need to tackle the issue of Iran and tackle it now, then who knows what's going to happen.
I was going to put you on the spot, Ido, and ask you how we should tackle Iran. If we have time at the end of our conversation, we can address that. But I think this would be a really good time, though, to talk about UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency. And I want to read this for the benefit of our listeners who either don't know or need to be reminded. And this is from the January 29th, 2024 Wall Street Journal. Quote, at least 12 employees of the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency had connections to Hamas's October 7 attack on Israel, and around 10% of all its Gaza staff have ties to Islamist militant groups, according to the intelligence reports reviewed by the Wall Street Journal. And then it goes on to say 6 United Nations Relief and Works Agency workers were part of the wave of Palestinian militants who killed 1,200 people in the deadliest assault on Jews since the Holocaust, according to the intelligence dossier. 2 helped kidnap Israelis. 2 others were tracked to sites where scores of Israeli civilians were shot and killed. Others coordinated logistics for the assault, including procuring weapons. And then it went on. And once again, that's from the Wall Street Journal, January 29th, 2024. Again, I'm not optimistic that the investigation that's going on right now on UNRWA will take it down. And I really want you to share your thoughts.
Well, UNRWA is an agency of the United Nations. The United Nations is an active part of the axis that is designed to undermine the United States and the West. Why? Because the 2/3 of the members of the United Nations are not democracies. Who's trying to undermine Western civilization? Who's trying to undermine the democratic nations? The non-democracies, the countries that are not being ruled as a democracy, the countries that are not allowing freedom.
And if I can interrupt you, in one of your presentations that I heard, you very articulately pointed out that when the UN was established, the majority of countries were democratic, they were free societies, and then the tide turned after decolonialization.
Exactly. So the UN was founded in 1945 with 51 members, later on became 55. And that's the UN that voted Israel into
existence.
It was when you look at the UN Charter, it's a very forward-looking, progressive text. But then, more and more countries joined the United Nations, 193 to be exact. 2/3 of them, as I said, are non-democracies, or actually, vast majority of them are tyrannies. And the United Nations is still operating with the democratic bylaw, meaning one nation, one vote.
Mm-hmm.
So the United States, that is responsible for the vast majority of the budget of the UN, has one vote, just like Burundi. Not that there's anything wrong with Burundi. My point is, there's something unbalanced, unfair in the entire structure. That's the reason for the demise of the UN. That's the reason for the stagnation. That's the reason for the inability of the UN to do anything. When you look at UNRWA, so UNRWA is in Gaza. It's a UN agency, but they need employees, so they hire Gazans. The Gazans, by and large, support Hamas. At least we know they voted them in January of 2006 with a 45% against 41% majority. And so no wonder, no surprise, we should not be surprised that the vast majority of people working for UNRWA are actually active supporters of Hamas, just as the vast majority of people that report from Gaza, journalists for reputable media outlets like the New York Times, are actually propagandists wearing falsely a vest that says the free press. We've seen that on October 7th. We've seen them reporting live from the kibbutzim, celebrating the massacre. The journalists, no different than UNRWA. You see the same thing in the school system, where people that were entrusted with educating young children in Gaza are actually engaged in indoctrination, fully paid for by the international community.
Including the United States.
Including the United States, including the European Union. And if you look at their textbooks, if you look at what they say about Jews, you understand where this hatred, this deep, Hamas allowed themselves to do things that the Nazis did not even do. The Nazis did not celebrate and document and shared and distributed their footage. In fact, they tried to hide what they were doing. They had records of everything they did, but we don't have footage of Jews dying in the gas chambers. The Nazis technically could have done it. They could have taken pictures of it. They didn't.
Yeah, and this is the death cult that we're dealing with, which then leads me to talk about the hostages. I mean, how do you even begin to negotiate with savages that are part of this death cult who don't value life when we value life? I mean, what's even that starting point? And then if we have to go through the Qataris, I mean, when you talk about undemocratic societies, I mean, those are two very large barriers to getting those hostages released. I mean, I hope that by the time that we release this episode, all hostages are released and they're back with their families safe and sound. But where do you even begin with that?
Yeah. So the Israel's decision makers had to face bad choices or worse choices. As we have a saying in Hebrew, nothing good is threatening us. That was the situation on October 7th, when we understood the scope and the magnitude of the disaster, of the massacre. The Israeli government had to make a decision what to do. And they made a decision that I'm afraid is now coming back to haunt us. And that decision was to give priority for, I guess, for public sentiment reasons. The Israeli public was angry and humiliated and demanded a massive military response. So they made a decision to prioritize ground invasion. What that do is it puts Israel today in an impossible situation, because Hamas released almost half of the hostages, and then is now demanding something that I'm not sure that all Israelis understand. They're not demanding the postponement of the fighting. They're demanding the end of the war with international assurances that they'll be able to stay and continue to govern Gaza, and the release of all Palestinian prisoners related to Hamas or not related to Hamas. That would gravely damage Israeli deterrence in the region. This would be perceived throughout the entire Arab world as a huge victory for Hamas, and of course, in the eyes of the Israeli public, as a major defeat of this particular Israeli government. Now, it's easy today for me to say, well, we should have done something else. By the way, in real time, I said it. And I even gave the example of the United States. How long did it take between 9/11 and the ground invasion to Iraq? A year and a half. What did the Americans do during that time? They prepared their army. And I'm setting aside the question of the outcome of the military campaign. But the Americans are strategic by definition. And so, yes, after 9/11, there was some military action. They were mostly concentrated on capturing bin Laden in the mountains of Afghanistan and so on. The Air Force was used, some artillery was used, but the ground invasion, the war itself, started only a year and a half later, because the US military needed the time to develop the right weapon system, to produce the right ammunition, to train the soldiers for those particular tasks, which we didn't do. So what we should have done is to understand from day one that the top priority is not ground invasion. You can always invade Gaza. The top priority is the release of the hostages. And what the Israeli government should have done, if they had thought more strategically and not caving into the Israeli popular sentiment, is to say, we're proposing the release of all Palestinian prisoners in return for all our prisoners. And that's how we should have started. And then, of course, the Israeli Air Force could have attacked targets in Gaza, and Israeli special units could have tried to hunt Yahya Sinwar just like they did with bin Laden. But we should have, and sure enough, by the way, you don't have to be a genius to understand that the Israeli army was not designed and is not designed to fight such a lengthy war. So we could have used the time, several months at least, if not a year, to prepare for the invasion. Not to mention that because we rushed in within 2 weeks, we didn't have enough time to prepare the diplomatic umbrella, which is so needed. Let me explain what is a diplomatic umbrella. When the United States decided to attack Yemen, they put together a coalition of 20 nations supporting and actively participating. That's the meaning of diplomacy. We didn't do that.
Two things coming out of that conversation. And first is just to play total devil's advocate here. Would Israel have seemed weak if it didn't go in when it went in? Because, as you know, power and might are really what is understood in the language of the neighborhood.
Yes, well, the answer is that, it's like this argument I used to have with my American friends about, I think that President Obama's failure to meet his own red line in 2013 in Syria is the reason for the regional collapse that we're seeing today, because shortly after that, Putin invaded Crimea and the rest is history. Now we have a full-blown war in Ukraine and so on. And that was a very strong signal to the Arab world that the United States doesn't have the stamina. Now, his failure to meet his own red line reflected a zero-sum perception of reality, meaning if I intervene militarily in Syria, it must involve a ground invasion, what we call boots on the ground. Mm-hmm. Well, there are so many different ways to be active militarily without boots on the ground, without risking one soldier. But they didn't do it. They didn't do it because of American public opinion, in my view. Israel could have done a lot without launching a full-blown ground invasion. And by the way, keeping the enemy,
guessing.
Yeah, guessing when is Israel going to strike, and not just against Hamas. What people have to understand is that October 7th taught us that we need to handle Hezbollah threat as well. So it's not just about Hamas.
You've spoken about, and this is something else I want to tease out from your comment just a moment ago, and you've spoken about really the need to build international coalitions, and this will be a generational effort. Yet Iran is on the march, and they're picking up their pace. And so I'm wondering, what should Israel do right now? Because there really isn't the time to make this a generational effort. The time is right now. So really, given the facts on the ground, what can Israel really do?
Well, pushing diplomacy very, very strongly, unfortunately.
Is it too late?
It's not. It's never too late for diplomacy. It's never too late for diplomacy. Problem is that when you're engaged in such a complex war, and the war is complex in Gaza, not because the enemy is mighty, but because you're fighting among 2.2 million civilians, and what we call uninvolved Palestinians. And so, we can make the argument that many of them support Hamas. That still doesn't make them terrorists, the fact that they support Hamas. And you have to abide by, the rules of engagement during war. And so it makes it very complex. This is very difficult for the Israeli leadership to find the bandwidth to build coalition. Plus, we don't have in the Israeli government today people the caliber of, let's say, the late Shimon Peres, whom I had the privilege of working with, that could do it. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have a lot of experience, diplomatic experience. The foreign minister just, assumed his position. Mr. Katz has zero diplomatic experience. And so it's a lot to ask from this government to be able to do that. They just don't have what it takes to do it.
Sounds to me like they need Ido in the government.
Uh, good luck with that. I left government in 2016, not to return, but I was not an elected official. I was just a diplomat, an
Right. You were part of the foreign
appointed
ministry.
appointed civil service, civil
Right.
servant. And I spent nearly 3 decades working for the government. I think I've done my share.
Right. You've done your duty. Now, listen, you know academia really inside and out. You know, there are pro-Hamas protesters on the streets, but of course, especially on the campuses. I want to focus there right now. I mean, from your perspective, where did schools go wrong? Importantly, how do we fix it? Can we fix it? Can we put the genie back in the bottle, Ido?
Yeah, so first of all, we need to remember that we're looking at predominantly in social sciences and humanities, which has been a problem for Zionism since the early days.
Mhm.
That's the first thing that we have to remember. So when we talk about, MIT and Harvard, we're not necessarily looking at computer science, business, or even, other departments, but it's predominantly humanities and social studies, and there's a reason for it. And the reason is intellectual, academic. They bought into this neo-Marxist view, which even when I attended Tel Aviv University in the 1980s and I studied sociology, that was the prevailing sentiment. All of my professors spoke the same language, and the language is to view the world through the prism of power and to try to interpret everything through the prism of struggle between oppressed and oppressors. That's the Marxist view. And of course, social media and the merciless algorithm that is pitting us against each other is making its contribution to that. And so the result is that those um, students and faculty uh, truly believe in this black and white binary view of reality, that the life is a constant struggle between good and evil, black and white. There's no room for nuance. The notion of anti-racism all of a sudden emerged, part of that Marxist view, and the result is that the Jew hatred, and I don't like the term anti-Semitism. I use the term Jew hatred because that's what it is. Jew hatred is perceived because of the issue of power. The notion that Jews have way more power than they deserve. They control society, they control Hollywood, they control the banks, they control whatever, politics. Now it's our turn, say the other parts of that coalition, imaginary coalition of minority in the age of identity politics. And so you create this hierarchy of suffering. The Jews are at the very bottom of it because they have power, they're white privilege. And so Jew hatred becomes a lesser form of racism, almost legitimate, to the point, Stephen, that feminist organizations in the United States are unable to even mention the fact that tens, if not more, of young Israeli girls were raped on October 7th, and their bodies were mutilated, and we have evidence. We have hard evidence that it happened. Imagine American female feminist intellectuals, the likes of Judith Butler and others, believing in the name of that neo-Marxist view that raping women is a legitimate form of resistance. Can you believe that? A feminist. There's a wonderful video, 30-minute video, difficult to watch video by journalist Barry Weiss, who's addressing this very issue brilliantly. And I urge all of our listeners to go on YouTube and look for that video. It's not an easy video to watch, but you can't support these feminist organizations after you hear Barry Weiss.
And so where do we go with that, on the college campus? How do we affect that change?
Well, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you give room for the other voices. We need to make sure that universities are truly going back to their mission statement, to their sole purpose, which is learning rather than re-indoctrination. I think Brett Stevens in the New York Times column called it social engineering. They think their job is to socially engineer minds, whereas their job is to cultivate people that think critically, that are critical of everything, that are willing to engage in a debate about anything and everything. I remember my first day on college. This is September of 1984. My late professor told us that the two most important words in science are "so what?"
In science, and why did he say that, Ido?
Because he said if you put "so what" at the end of every sentence, then you guarantee human progress. And think about it. What he's actually saying is that critical thinking is essential for evolution, of progression,
Mhm.
of ideas. Now, what you're seeing on campus is exactly the opposite. And it's become like this Orwellian environment where
Yeah.
diversity is a code word for highlighting the differences between us rather than the similarities, rather than celebrating what we have in common. When we say diversity, what we mean is highlighting the differences. This is the essence of identity politics. And then when they talk about inclusion, it's a code word for excluding Jews and to a certain degree Asians because they are perceived as powerful.
Yeah.
And when they say equality, it's a code word to actually say equality not of opportunities, but rather of outcomes, meaning equality becomes equity. We demand equal share of the pie. And that's the wrong kind of DEI. There is a good kind of DEI that emphasizes belonging and is colorblind, a DEI that makes everybody feel comfortable, and DEI that cultivates, the only reason why diversity works, you can see that in Israel, is because of the tension between the different people. That tension creates the magic of creativity.
Yeah.
It happens in the creative worlds, as you know very well, because you come from the creative worlds. But think about the Beatles without the creative tension between Lennon and McCartney. Right? Think about the NBA without the tension between Magic and Bird. Right? So that's what you need, not to be afraid of it. On the contrary, we need to celebrate the ability to argue and to make sure that our students are resilient. What you have now is a generation of fragile students that are threatened by ideas, they are threatened by words, they look at their own feelings as hard evidence, they're intimidated by anything they don't know. And I see some of the videos on YouTube of student behavior. It's just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. So what needs to be done is heavy regulation on social media. We need to regulate the algorithm. We need to make sure that we put in place authentication technologies and verification technologies, educate our children, certainly young children must exercise what we call informational distancing, distance themselves from informational resources. We must make sure that we again cultivate an environment that is encouraging debate, not the contrary. And of course, lastly, we need to change the way faculty is selected in campuses because what's happening now, they're duplicating themselves. If faculty is authorized to select themselves, basically they will just duplicate the existing situation, and there'll be no fresh views and new blood coming in.
And let's
That's the
face it
main
also,
problem.
and let's face it also, money talks. And you have a lot of these big donors that are saying we've had enough of this.
Right. And I think that the donors should say it. I think that what Bill Ackman is doing and Ken Griffin is very important. But they should not disengage. They should stay on board. I think that's my opinion. They should stay on board and influence from within. That's why I like what Bill Ackman is doing, because Bill Ackman did two things that are critically important. The first is that he exposed the fragility of the pro-Hamas students, because when he said, I want your names to make sure I will never hire you, there was a barrage of lame excuses online. Oh, I did not know that I signed this petition. I had no idea that I was even a member of this organization. That's the first thing that he did. The second thing is he introduced the activist approach, which I believe is the real thing. Now, to go one step beyond that, we need to engage in a massive legal effort to sue the individuals and the institutions that allow those individuals to express Jew hatred. Those institutions that failed to protect their Jewish students or any other student should be sued because they failed to uphold their own standards. They failed to uphold their own regulations. This has nothing to do with the First Amendment. So when the president of Harvard University was testifying in Congress, she was afraid to be exposed legally. She ended up being exposed legally anyhow. And Harvard is going to face a barrage of lawsuits. It's coming. And so are other universities. And let me tell you even that, those students or young Americans, I don't know if they were actually students or paid Palestinian activists, because we know that someone is paying them. Who's paying for all those billboards? Who's paying for all those flags? Certainly not the universities, right? So where the money's coming from? They were tearing down the posters of the hostages, each and every person that was recorded. And we identified who they are. We know their names. We need to pursue them legally. When I say pursue them legally, is inform their employers of what they did. If they're on a student visa, have their visa revoked. There's so many things that we can do legally, and we need the budget to do that. I was very sorry to see that Robert Kraft is spending $7 million on a 30-second ad that talks about Jewish hatred, whatever that means. He should have used the term Jew hatred. But you know how many lawsuits we could have, put in place with $7 million?
Yeah, it could have been money better spent, indeed. Ido, as we begin to wind down our conversation, because I'm super mindful of your time, what actions can our average listener take? And I've heard you talk about, I'm kind of leading the witness here, if you don't mind, but I've heard you talk about the 70-20-10 rule. And I'm wondering if you can address that in the context of what listeners can do to really affect change in this time that we're living in right now.
Yeah, so the 10-20-70 rule is that in every major open pluralistic society, whether it's the Canadian society or the American society, you have about 10% that oppose Israel no matter what. They don't like us. Even when we went to Oslo, they didn't like us. Then you have 20% that like us unconditionally. They love Israel. And then you have 70% that are uninterested and uninformed. And the theory is that we need to provide the 70%, which is our room to grow from a marketing business point of view, provide them with the immune system to be able to deal with the toxic messages of the 10%. How do you do that? By making sure that they understand what Israel is all about, that they know who we are. And I always give the example of Richie Torres. Richie Torres used to be that 70%. When he was elected the city council member in New York City, he went to Israel, I think it was 2010 or 2011, came back with knowledge. He was in Israel. He encountered Israelis. When you say Israel is apartheid to Richie Torres, he's able to tell you, don't tell me that. I was in Israel. I know what Israel is all about. When you make the claim that Israel is, performing genocide in Gaza, Richard Torres is not going to buy this because he has that immune system. Now, sadly, we in the state of Israel and the organized Jewish community over the years, we failed in giving those 70% the protective shield that they need by not broadening the scope through which Israel was perceived. This is the whole idea of branding Israel, is to give those 70% that intimate knowledge of Israel. But it's never too late, because one day tourism will recover. It's going to take years, but tourism will recover. One day we will be in a position to provide them those 70% with the needed emotional connection to Israel. And that's the key, right? One of the reasons millions of Israelis were sobbing on 9/11, even Israelis that never been to New York, is because New York is so real. It's part of the conversation in Israel. New York is something that you see in the movies. It's something that you read about. It's in the songs that you love. New York is a living thing for Israelis. Not to mention the fact that 500,000 every year actually visit New York. So now you can understand the importance of an emotional connection. Now, JNF is very good, perhaps the leading organization in the Jewish world doing that. We need to do more of that. We need to make sure that our children are coming to study in Israel, whether it's in the Alexander Muss High School or later on for a college degree in Israel. They can get an excellent education in English. The tuition is 1/4 of what you would pay in the United States, and plus they'll have a connection to Israel. And we have some of the best universities in the country. So there's so many things that we can do, and not to mention what you're very good at, bringing influencers to Israel, people that influence public opinion, to come and see the place for themselves.
Great. And on that note, Ido, we're going to leave it right there. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this episode of IsraelCast. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to having you, I think, for maybe a 4th or 5th conversation. I've lost track on the number of times you've been on the program, but listen, it's never enough. It's never enough. We want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All
Thank
right.
you.
And we'll have info about Ido on the show notes page of this episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And of course, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. I might even add some episodes in between. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Simply search for IsraelCast. It's that easy. And don't forget to rate and review us, because that really helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more folks around the world to find us and to learn about Israel, just like Ido was talking about. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And it takes a whole moshav indeed to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, J.D. Krebs, and Ellie Kodrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios, right here in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. And for more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, Ido would love to hear from you, and so would I. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.